Hello again, you're with View from Stormont. Coronavirus has put a massive strain on the lives of many, but initial studies show that the young are particularly struggling with mental health as a result of disruption to their education, a loss of routine and social isolation. Even before March, rates of anxiety and depression among the young in Northern Ireland were 25% higher than in the rest of the UK and the Republic. Jordan Motes has been speaking to some of our future generation about the challenges they're facing as a result of the COVID crisis.
Most of my friends have had to isolate at least once, so if things don't get any better by June when we're doing our exams, people might have had to isolate up to 7 times.
The people that I would have been close with before, do they even want to speak to me anymore? Because you're not seeing them face to face.
My friends are like my support system. I would go to them for anything. To talk to them and not to be able to see them was difficult.
If I'm not in work, I can't do my MVQ qualification, which means I won't get my proper qualification from my apprenticeship course.
Putting pencil to paper in a crowded exam hall didn't happen last year. The fiasco around results caused the biggest U-turn of the pandemic, but A-level students this year fear another debacle is on the horizon. The worry is there'll be no allowances for periods of isolation.
We are going to, at the end of the day, according to the Minister, have to do the same exams at the end of this year with no content reductions and very little changes. And there'll be almost no allowances given for the fact that we are isolating 14 days at a time.
And how difficult is it when you have to isolate, but yet you still have that learning to do in class, which your other students and other friends are getting that opportunity to be in school?
Teachers are doing their best. They're moving mountains in this, but at the end of the day, nothing beats the face-to-face interaction and being able to say to your teacher, I don't understand this, can you help me with this? But it's not the same, and there needs to be allowances made for the fact that online learning isn't on a par with in-person learning.
Obviously, last year's set of A-level students, there was a debacle over how the grades are going to be worked out. In the end, it was those predicted grades. Should that be the same this year? Let your teachers decide?
It would be ideal if we could do exams, but we don't live in an ideal world, as this pandemic has really shown across all sectors. So if we end up in a situation where students are not prepared and can't cover the content, and they haven't had a fair shot at exams, and it's not going to be fair for everyone to sit exams because some people have had less exposure to learning than others, then I do believe that might be the best outcome of this.
How are you and your friends coping with all of that?
It's very challenging. It's a very worrying time for everyone and a very difficult time for everyone, and at times it does seem like there's no end in sight to the pandemic and that life may never go back to normal, but I think we're all trying to keep one another going and we're all going through it together and remind one another that it will end.
Learning a trade and getting hands-on experience is another route into employment for thousands of young people. With shutdowns and collapsing markets, though, COVID means many apprentices are struggling to complete their qualifications. 21-year-old Adam Russell is learning a trade in the aerospace sector. He's been furloughed and potentially could also be made redundant.
I don't have my qualification yet, which makes it harder for me to actually try and get another job if I do lose mine. If I'm not in work, I can't do my MVQ qualification, which means I won't get my proper qualification from my apprenticeship course, which is really bad, as I want to go in next year to do my higher HLA level in my apprenticeship. And if I cannot go back to work and finish my apprenticeship, I can't go in next year in school, which is a big worry for me. My workplace is aerospace industry, and seeing that COVID might last even longer is really bad for them, as they won't pick up work anytime soon. So it's just bad news for me altogether, because they will be less reluctant to bring workers in if they're not getting any more new work or contracts in.
Many teenagers will have celebrated schools closing, but for young carers like 18-year-old Chloe Rooney, it will have meant a lifeline was taken away. She's a carer for her mum and brother. Lockdown meant that role became 24/7.
Still having to do my work myself for school and help my wee brother with his work as well as help my mum out around the house. It was difficult trying to balance everything and get deadlines done in time.
What was your biggest worry during COVID and having to cope and deal with all the pressures that were building up throughout that 7-month period?
My life has to be routine. That's how I can cope with everything that's going on, but then you don't really have a routine in lockdown or because of COVID, because you don't know what's going to happen. So I was confused on what to do, so it was kind of difficult to get used to.
Teenage years are meant to be full of fun, making friends and creating memories. COVID has changed things, and the worry for some is those friendships may not be there at the other side.
Our solid group would be 15 or 20 people, And at the moment, it's like you have to keep that so small. And now it's like it's a group of 6 people, but it's from 2 households. So effectively, it's 2 people can meet up. So you're kind of looking at your social media like, oh, I haven't been invited out. That's weird. But then you're sitting thinking, but I can't go out because I'm not part of that bubble. And like I'm bubbled with people in my school, but then other people are bubbled with others from other schools, and you can't mix with the same people that you could before. And like from being in drama, like we would have had a solid wee group that we would have met with every Saturday morning. I haven't seen them people since January. And, you know, there's a whole groups of friends that I just haven't seen because I can't.
Usually the area around Queen's would be full of activity. This year, remote learning and COVID restrictions mean it is anything but. Young students walk these streets trying to find their way in life. What's clear is there's no map for navigating growing up during a pandemic.
Jordan Moats reporting. To discuss the issues, I'm joined by the interim mental health champion Siobhan O'Neill and Kate Moffett from Include Youth. To start with you, Siobhan, 1 in 8 young people had anxiety and depression before COVID. By how much do you expect that to rise?
To be honest, Paul, the data that's coming through is showing us that most young people are incredibly resilient, so we're not expecting that to rise by too much. But I think it's important to note that there will be groups of young people who are more at risk of poor mental health and adverse mental health outcomes here, and that those are the groups that we need to highlight, and we need to make sure that they're looked after. And some of the evidence that's coming through from the co-space study, for example, showing us that young people who don't have access to outdoor spaces, young people with disabilities, young people with existing issues may well be disadvantaged as a result of the restrictions. So it's really important that we look at those high-risk groups and do what we can to make sure that those young people are protected. But it's also important to note that taking young people out of school actually disadvantages them and can, over time, over the long term, lead to a reduction in their mental well-being. So we need to be careful how we manage this pandemic as we go into a longer phase of it with maybe more lockdowns and more restrictions,
right,
just to make sure that young people aren't disadvantaged, that we don't tip more young people into that mental health. We
will tease that out with you later in the interview, but let me bring in Kate at this point. You work with those who have left the care system, Kate. How has lockdown affected them?
So we work with a range of young people, including those who have left the care system and who are indeed in care. So those young people, many of them who have transitioned maybe into independent living, have found it extremely difficult during lockdown due to isolation and loneliness. A lot of support services that they had been in contact with either were stopped at that period of time or moved to online. And for our young people, that was very challenging for them. Loneliness and isolation were two, I suppose, of the main things for them that was difficult during lockdown time.
Okay, and just let me come to you on that point, Siobhan O'Neill, because we often think about isolation affecting older people, but that's not been the case in that report we just saw there.
Indeed, that's the stereotype of an older person being more lonely, but actually, again, a really important study that looked at loneliness and suicidal thoughts of various age groups during the pandemic, led by Rory O'Connor, found that it was the younger age groups, those 18 to 35-year-olds, that were experiencing higher rates of loneliness, and they were more lonely than their older counterparts. So remember, we have different expectations of life whenever we're in that age group, and whenever you've had your university education disrupted and those contacts that you have, your social contacts fractured because of the restrictions, then it can be very difficult for young people and they can feel extremely lonely. But it's important to make sure that we differentiate between loneliness and mental illness. Most people will be able to get through those periods if we give them the correct support.
Kate, are you concerned that young people may not be given the help that they need?
I think at this time it's incredibly important that young people's voices are heard and they're listened to and their rights are being met. At Include Youth, we would put young people at the forefront, and it's their experiences and their voices that we want to put to the Northern Ireland Executive, for example. I know Siobhan attended one of our events recently where young people were able to put questions to MLAs and to Siobhan O'Neill around mental health, and those type of events are really important for us to ensure that young people are listened to.
But isn't there a risk that people will fall through the net if their voice is not heard and they don't get the help they need?
Absolutely, and I think as an organisation that we need then to advocate for those young people, that those young people's voices who aren't being heard and are falling out of the net, we need to ensure that it's our duty that we can speak for them if they can't speak for themselves.
How worried are you about the people that you are working with right now?
I would have major concerns. Certainly COVID has highlighted a lot of issues for young people, maybe issues that were already on the forefront, but it's highlighted more, like depression, like anxiety, like different issues like that. I do agree with Siobhan, our young people are so resilient and have come through such a lot already, and a lot of them really just need extra help and support.
And that is something that I'm hoping we will be able to finish on at the end of this interview. But to come back to you, Siobhan, there are lots of things in life that we take for granted these days. Access to the new technologies, but they're not available to everybody. Is that going to be something that will hold you back?
Absolutely. The pandemic and the restrictions have really amplified the impacts of inequality and poverty. And we find that there's a lot of young people who aren't even able to see their friends and their social contacts because they don't have those digital devices. Whenever the schools were closed, access to computers and technology and even good broadband and Wi-Fi became a real difficulty. And we see more and more evidence coming out that young people who were in situations of poverty and neglect, that they were more disadvantaged, and those are the young people we really need to be concerned about. So it's about those tailored interventions and targeting groups of young people who might be more at risk, whilst also putting out that positive, hopeful message that most of our young people will be able to get through this. They will not be disadvantaged in the long run, but we do need to keep an eye on them too.
What pressure can you bring to bear on the executive then to get the money?
Well, I can. What we're doing right now is we're developing a mental health strategy, and we're going to be developing a strategy for a world-leading mental health service. And then we all need to ask the government to fund that appropriately. But the government are committed to this issue, and they're committed to expenditure here because they realise that this has savings in the long run, and that if we're going to flourish at the other end of this pandemic, we need to invest in the mental health of our young people and indeed all the population.
Okay. And without investment, Kate, what do you believe we would be staring into here?
I think it's going to put young people at a further disadvantage. I think the whole digital poverty issue is enormous at the moment, and COVID has highlighted that even more so. We have been lucky enough through small pots of funding, we've been able to provide laptops for some of our young people, and that's helped them enormously. So I think without these, young people are going to be further and further.
And yet, you and Siobhan are at one on this. The resilience that will allow these people to see it through.
I think given some of the backgrounds of the young people that we certainly work with and what they've gone through, they've already shown enormous resilience in their lives, and I think it just shows how strong a character they are, and I believe we can learn a lot from these young people.
Siobhan, resilience, is that the way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of us are going to look back at this time and remember how we did come through it, the strengths that we drew upon, and we'll be able to use those when we face other challenges in life. So this is a time when we need to focus on our strengths, and we need to come together and try and get that sense of being in this together again, because we really do. We really have to come through this together and support one another, and particularly support our young people because they're losing a lot right now.
Siobhan O'Neill and Kate Moffett, thank you both very much indeed. Well, if you or someone you know has been affected by any of the issues raised in the discussion, here are some helpline numbers which can offer advice and support.